right, we got some nice extra bopping in there. It was fantastic. Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone from wherever you are in the world, whatever time zone it is, whatever weather you're experiencing. It's pouring rain here now in New Hampshire. But we are so thrilled and pleased that you are joining us for what is going to be, seriously, y'all, this is an amazing panel. So you're going to be really glad that you came. A couple of housekeeping things. You're all used to me saying this. If you've joined any of our other sessions, please do know that we are recording this. So if for whatever reason you're uncomfortable with that, this is your chance to turn off your video or to get out of the session. And also please do note that the live transcript function does work and actually works pretty well. Although the joke now is that it thinks Lisa Zahabi, my name, is Lisa as a hobby, which is sort of funny. So it's not perfect, but it's better than not having it. So if you find that useful, please do turn that on. Also, please do know that this is the second session of our teaching theme day for ShiftED, and we have 3 more coming up after this one. So please do come join us for the rest of the content today. We have just some really phenomenal sessions in the works. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our 2 volunteer moderators, community moderators for the session. We have Brian Perry and Andrea Cardinal, who are joining us, who are going to kind of keep track of the stuff happening in the chat and help us with the questions and answers session, because it's a lot for the panelists to kind of keep track of on their own. So we're so grateful that the 2 of them were willing to come join us and do that work. So now, for reals, without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Roshanak Keyghobadi, and I'm sure I said that totally wrong, and she will correct me. What was that?
You did great.
Oh, great, excellent. But Roshanak is amazing. She stepped up and organized a panel around this topic last year for Shift, and it was incredible. And so we knew we had to invite her back to do the same thing. And she has just put together just a stacked panel of amazing people to talk about this topic. So I can't wait. I've got my pen and paper ready to take lots of notes, but Roshanak, please, you take it away.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Hello, everyone. My name is Roshanak Keyghobadi. I teach at Farmingdale State College at State University of New York. I would like to thank you, Lisa, thanks to you and Alberto, Mina, and AIJ Design Educators community for creating this wonderful opportunity to exchange ideas and communicate with everyone. I also want to thank Andrea and Brian for moderating this session. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend all of the panels this year, but I tried to look at the videos, which is wonderful, that is available right away, so you can keep up with everything. But this was an amazing week, starting with Lisa's welcome, where she painted a night sky for us and imagined us as stars, each of us in that sky, that as a community, we are going to light up our classrooms, our communities, and have that influence on these spaces. Also, Louise, Brockett, and Briar always amaze me with their hard work and enthusiasm for developing and sharing the People's Graphic Design Archives, which provides all of us with unique resources for teaching history of graphic design. Also, Ellen, Farah, and Valentina, and Kalina opened up various possibilities for expanding narratives and to be inclusive in our classrooms and stretching and opening the canon. Archana reminded us and me that if there's no chair for me at the table, bring my own chair or create my own table, and to discuss decolonization of our classrooms. So I am excited. I'm so honored to have this panel introduce our panel to you today. We have Tasheka Orsina Sutton from North Carolina State University and Vermont College of Art. Raquel Castedo from Society of Design Arts at AIGA Baltimore. Brockett Horne from Maryland Institute College of Art. Briar Levit from Portland State University. Lisa Maione from Kansas City Art Institute. YuJune Park from Parsons School of Design. Adity Saxena from Woxsen University. Huda Smitshuijzen, AbiFarès from Khatt Foundation. And Aggie from Washington University in St. Louis. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a slideshow with you. And as a group, we decided that we are not going to present individually. And we would like to share this opportunity with all of you to have a discussion. So it would be a dialogue for all of us. And I'm going to share my screen and then explain the format. Okay, so last year's panel was not such a big panel. It was 3 of us, and the topic of our panel was teaching the history of graphic design in the contemporary global context. And there were a series of questions for all of the participants to think about the whys, what, who, which, why are we teaching graphic design? What is it that we want to include in this curriculum? What can we find out about past and present role models? What can we know about different cultures and design histories? What is missing? Is there a canon of global graphic design history? Are there any themes? So what are the key influences? Who is qualified to teach graphic design history? What is our role as educators? Are we historians, scholars, designers, teachers, and also who are our students? And who should we go to if we need help? And another question was what are the resources that we have? Are there any books, essays, interviews? Can we use guest designers as speakers? Can we use any films that are helpful? Are the libraries good places to go to? Are there any archives that we can look into? And I also, this is a thumbnail of that whole presentation. And over here, you can see that I was focusing on Meg's history of graphic design and the way that certain information is not updated and not very inclusive, speaking specifically about the section about Middle Eastern graphic design and Iranian graphic design, showing what is included and what is excluded. Basically all male from similar generations, same generation of Iranian designers, not very good examples even of their work, and excluding all of the wonderful female graphic designers in Iran. And at this point, I also mentioned that how even the title of Meg's book changed from A History of Graphic Design to Meg's History of Graphic Design. And this also reflects that this is just one story. This is just one history. So don't know why I don't go next. Oops. Okay, so now this year our questions are about teaching global histories of graphic design, and you can see the title changed, and we are focusing really on multiple stories, multiple histories. I asked the panel to come up with 3 different questions related to this topic. So I just go through these very briefly, but in the chat box, you will see the all of these questions. And if it's just too much to just go through, and it may be too fast to scroll down or up, I also created a Miro board with all of these questions on them that you can actually participate and add your comments and your ideas to that board. And it would be wonderful to see all of your feedback. So Tasheka's questions were, the first one is mostly about revisiting the canon and rethinking what is to be included and what has been excluded, looking at graphic design as a tool to improve community, and other ways of teaching graphic design history. Raquel focused on changing the process of teaching, looking at resources, changing that happened in the past years, and Brockett is mentioning the ideal textbook, what that would be, and history, bringing history into studio, and also new forms of scholarship. Briar is emphasizing engaging students, what students learn, and the process of that, and getting it into their professional work, and also looking into the curriculum and evolving our curriculum. Lisa is looking at what not to teach, what is it that is useful and what is not, and what students learn from the process, the practice, the ways to study design histories and the studio practice, and also the frameworks. YuJune is looking into the idea of history of ideas rather than history of individuals, teaching that, and the connection between the history and studio. Also frameworks for, I'm sorry, history of ideas, and then broader approach to graphic design history in relationship to culture, history, technology, and society. And also she's mentioning competitions and looking into that topic. Adity is proposing looking into student-centered approach, the visual components that we can use while we're teaching the history, and the mindset of students when they're learning about the history. Huda is proposing and questioning, like, how can we collect undocumented histories, then how to be inclusive, and how to have all of these contributions of different traditions and the world heritage reflected in our teaching. Aggie is talking about history to make connections between historical understanding and studio practice, helping our students understand the ways that design performs in the world, and how might design histories better reflect the changing emphasis in our field. And I'm also interested in to know how can we incorporate and encourage global collective research and dialogue, and also what are the resources that we can use, and how can we learn from our students, because they are the most important part of this equation of our teaching. So how can we learn from them? So we would love to know what are your questions, what are your ideas, and as I said, there is a board that you can access and contribute and collaborate with us on that board, and add your ideas and questions. So again, thank you, Lisa, Alberto, Mina, Brian, Andrea, and design education educators community. And I'm going to stop sharing and get back to all of you. Okay. All right, so I think just to start our conversation, I would like to invite Lisa to start with her comments and ideas. Lisa.
Thanks, Roshanak. And hi, good
Hey,
morning, good evening.
Really quickly,
Oh,
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Roshanak, I was just going to ask, do you mind to change the permissions on the Miro board? Not maybe, so folks, only those on the panel are able to comment. While Lisa's talking, you can remedy that. Sorry, Lisa, I can't wait to hear.
You know what? I am so new to the Miro board. I have to figure it out how to do it.
Well, you have time, right? Because Lisa's going to share some insights with us.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. Roshanak, I'll give us some time. Well, first of all, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone who's here. Really honored to be a part of this conversation and to be in presence with you all. And Roshanak, thanks for bringing us all together again. It was a pleasure to have the conversation last year, and so awesome to continue it. So just in going through all of these questions, I couldn't help but begin to sort of see some connections between the questions that we all proposed. So maybe just some initial observations. So embracing the multiplicity of design as a cultural response, nodding to Simon Charway, who speaks about that as well in his practice. Seeing design as design history specifically as a tool for building community, and maybe building community perhaps being through discovery of stories, discovery of new information and conversations. The question of what does the textbook look like? Is there a textbook? What is the compilation of things that help guide the teaching of the subject matter, this type of framework to incorporate? And absolutely a nod and sort of connection to the People's Archive of Graphic Design and that great work, students that we are engaging with as citizen scholars, we as educators, as citizen scholars, regardless of whether we have PhDs in history or a curiosity budding, we are all already engaging in that work and in those questions, and we have things to contribute to it. So seeing the classroom as a place to foster those ways that we can connect with each other seems like one of our opportunities. But perhaps one thing that came up in several people's questions is this connection and engagement with histories and connecting that with studio practice. So I wondered if we might start there. I think seeing the history class as less of a seminar and less of a textbook place and more of a studio, a workshop, an inquiry-based situation. I wonder the different approaches that folks are taking. So maybe we can start there. How are we connecting histories with studio practice?
That's a class I would definitely take.
Well, one thing that someone did with the archive, specifically the People's Graphic Design Archive, was a educator had students look through the archive, select a designer that interested them. It was a motion design class, and they studied that designer, and then they selected a piece, and they made that piece have motion. So it might have been a poster, most of them were posters. So that was a pretty simple way to engage them in a historical work, and then also have like a very practical application of motion design. And the pieces were beautiful. So that was one way. I mean, I always, and this is a very simple thing. I teach page layout. Those are the studio classes that I teach. And this may be something that everyone does, is I show work that spans, the years, and it spans the decades, and spans decades and sort of, applications, so it's so much is just about what kind of work you're showing, and what kind, everything from the scripts that you're showing. You don't need to be showing everything in Latin script. You don't need to be showing, only, of course, Bauhaus works, or work that was just made within the last 10 years. So I feel like those are really simple things, but other people may have more clever applications.
I think a very interesting way is to connect with social media, because there are two things what I normally prefer to do. One, when I teach the history, I think history is one of the very powerful tool to connect students with the research, and especially when we consider the graphic design, the research is still in a baby actually. So when I take the class, I show them the picture and I ask them, okay, fine, you can use the semantic or you can use the rhetoric, especially for the PG students, that you analyze the pictures. Another way for the undergrads, I prefer that to connect them with the social media. So probably I make whatever you are making, you upload it. Right, like you told that motion graphics, it's a very interesting way to grab the students' attention. But when they make it and they just keep it with them, or they just share it with their peer group, that is better to motivate them than to upload on the social media platform. And I saw these young students, they are so excited about the number of likes, number of comments. I think this is the way probably we can connect them with the history class. Yeah,
I agree. I think working within the space that is relatable and to them and exciting to them, and social media is it. I mean, not that I also am excited by social media, I'm not gonna lie, but absolutely. I also similarly, so the teacher who did that motion design project shared that work with us, and then we shared it on the People's Graphic Design Archive, and people were excited to see that work. You can see it on our Instagram. But I also do with my, similar to you, Adity, I have an Instagram account for my history, for all the work that my students do around history. And so they write short history research, and I post it on there. And then also I've recently started a workshop. I recently ran a workshop where they did research and then made a piece of work informed by that research. And so I posted that work as well. And it becomes real. It becomes somehow more real to them when it is on that space, for sure.
I might share something I tried once years ago in the context of a studio. It's similar to that kind of the project that you talked about, Briar, but a little bit different. I asked students to choose 2 works from history so they're choosing their own works, which means that already the student is thinking about what they're interested in from the past, and it's not necessarily an assigned referent, but to choose two things from different time periods, to study the works, to annotate how the historical ideas in that time sort of conditioned the approach to form, and then to make a new work by synthesizing the ideas from the two. And this was in the context of like teaching history as a way of learning form. So it had its limitations, this particular assignment. It didn't really elucidate practices, but it did talk about how to think about compositional space. And I saw students have some really, I don't know, they seemed like unmoored by the project, and having not thought of compositional space the way, you know, their reference had in the past. So it was successful in some ways. Something I'd like to try again, I think, someday.
Building on what Aggie said, I've also run a similar assignment where students actually, they choose a manifesto, a historical manifesto, and they have to reinterpret it visually today, or choose a contemporary manifesto. And the reason we do this is because we want students to unpack the relationship between form and the history of ideas. And this is sort of critical because I find that sometimes it's very easy to kind of graze styles from the past without really unpacking why things look the way that they did, how they're expression of certain social, cultural, and larger, you know, technological kind of frameworks that were happening at the time. I think another thing that we started to do that's very simple is, in addition to asking students what a design is and who the audience is, we're asking where does it live? And that's really critical, because by asking the question where, you're forcing them to kind of look at design with an understanding that is part of a living material and visual culture, and not just something that's, you know, meant for consumption, or an artifact that lives in, you know, or just as an artifact, but that it's something that's contributing to a larger discourse. And I think even extending that to today, when we ask students to work on this manifesto project, if it's happens, if this work is outside of the Western kind of canon, really encouraging students to connect with contemporary designers working in that space, because I think the act of creation is also an act of community, and that by connecting with amazing organizations like Huda's, you know, the Khatt Foundation, that our students can actively participate in the discourse and kind of dialogue around sort of design practices.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that. I think that's always something questionable. Like sometimes when you look at work from another culture, and if you don't really understand the meaning of it, it's very easy to kind of judge it from the way it looks. So sometimes it looks exotic or beautiful, but you actually don't understand why it works within that context. And these are kind of like, I think, a really big challenge in teaching, of kind of trying to get into the makers, like to have more of insight from the perspective of the maker of this work and what it meant to them, and to have that available online, you know, more than just images of beautiful stuff on Instagram, which are very inspiring, but they lack that depth that I think is really important for starting to open up your way of looking at design, of how design functions in different cultures, how people read certain visual elements like text or type or color, or even like direction of reading, you know, that changes also the way you think. Like what happens to people that can read in 3 different directions compared to people that read in only one direction. And these are kind of questions that I think like really makes the global context more complex for teachers and for, you know, teaching design. But it's very important to open up the mind. I think it will have an effect on the way, also the way we design in a more emphatic way, more humane way, by being able to put ourselves in the shoes of someone we don't fully understand.
Yeah. We also use Instagram in all of our classes. And what I found is it's very unsuccessful when students use it like almost like a coffee table book. It's like all these beautiful images without any of the essays, right? But I always encourage students, I was like, Instagram should actually be used as a phone book, where it's an opportunity to connect with living designers who are interested in the ideas that you're interested in.
One thing I really wanted to know from the panel, probably Huda can, I would request you to answer this thing, that it is very important when we talk about design, how the culture, the gender, the different aspects is related to the design. Design has its own language. So let's say, from India, when I teach, or let's say from United States, when you teach your students, how you ensure that your students should understand the different cultural aspects of graphic design? How can we do that?
Well, I was just this brings up a point that I think Huda sort of reminded me of, which is just simply that I feel overwhelmed as a history educator in feeling responsible for educating on a global scale about graphic design history, because my knowledge is limited and I want to be able to give as much as possible. And I imagine that a lot of other people feel the same way. But I just wanted to put that out there. Like, I'm trying to evolve my knowledge as much as possible. But it is still limited.
Yeah, it's also like another problem that is, in general, graphic design history, there might be multiple histories, but the ones that are best documented are Eurocentric history. And so it also gives a problem for everyone, including people from within the culture itself, of having that knowledge and having access to resources of things that are not documented. And so, for example, in the Arab world, there's a lot of designers, but nobody ever knows anything about them. And sometimes you see the work, some are famous, but they're very few. Often, like Roshanak said, it's mostly men, a certain generation. And so it's also our responsibility is to keep on looking, like it's a never ending project in a way. So when we started, the Khatt Foundation looking at doing research, but also started to go into publishing, then the responsibility is again, like, what do you publish and where do you start? Because it's so overwhelming, there's so much missing. And you have to start somewhere, and you'll never be complete, you'll never be comprehensive, but at least if you are in the process of looking at ideas and looking at connections also, which we found through a lot of the series of books that we do in-depth research on one designer that may be, iconic within their own country, but the rest of the world, including the rest of the region, doesn't know about them, is to look at, the connections, the histories of these people and, where they studied. And sometimes there's, it's also important to understand that there's always these international networks that are there. So people sometimes study, abroad, but then come back into their own country, and then they become more conscious about reviving their own culture and giving it value. So they learn they learn not just the techniques, but also the way to think about design. And then they bring that perspective and it evolves into something new, and they start a new school. And so I think it's really important also in teaching today is to highlight the connections between cultures and also highlight, the differences and the ways to understand things differently and to look at them differently. Yeah, and it's overwhelming is the good word.
Yeah, it's funny because
work.
We have I literally have this on my desk right now, and which I'm excited about, but also terrified because I literally have a 10-week class, and so I have, my curriculum is expanding and contracting. I'm taking things out and moving things around, and so that's just and trying to figure out what stays and what goes, which is what Lisa is talking about. And so you become the person who makes those decisions, which is a little scary too. Still a little powerful, but.
I wanted to comment on Briar and all your inputs. I feel like showing vulnerability or sharing this that you're telling us with your students, I think it's a good start because we are all collaborating in this process. It's impossible to know everything. of course. And I guess depending on the city we are, our background, the school we're teaching at, we're gonna make decisions about what we're gonna be telling, right? And just giving the students a heads up and asking for their collaboration, I think it's an amazing start. That, you know, coming from this humble place of we are all learning about this, I think it's important. And I wanted to share with you. And first of all, just thank you all, because I feel so, you know, proud, honored and happy to be with you. I taught in Brazil for 8 years, and I moved to Baltimore a couple of years ago. And the experience of starting to identify myself as Latina outside of Brazil, it's a process, and you know, that was interesting for me to see how much I don't know about Latin American graphic design and how much I want to know, and all my efforts in the past 2 years has been like to learn more about it and share whatever I can with the community in Baltimore and in the US. So I feel like coming, you know, telling the students that you want their collaboration, I think it's an amazing start. Yeah.
I also think that we have to emphasize our students more. Our students are a big part of this whole circle of learning. And in our school, we have a very diverse body of students. So each of them with their own culture, wealth of information that we can learn from them. So as a collaboration, the projects or the lessons that we give, it can be very inclusive in terms of including our students in our teaching, really. And collaborating with them and learning from them and just saying exactly, I'm not an expert in all of these, you can help me, we can all do it together, and we learn through the process. So I think that will help a lot, and it would be very inclusive, and they would feel free and more at ease with the whole process.
I also want to say,
go
ahead.
Please go on, YuJune.
Oh no, that there's so many, that it's great that there are a lot of initiatives at place to also expand research materials for students that have a more global perspective, like the AIGA's Beyond the Bauhaus initiative. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Typegeist that we're relaunching in the fall with essays by Saki Mafundikwa and Toshi Omogari, which hopes to kind of help fill the gap just a little bit by reaching out to people and asking them to provide resources on world scripts, and how to teach typography around world scripts. And I think part of the work that needs to be done by the design community in general is actually translation. We have a huge problem where we have so many typographic resources that haven't been translated yet into English, and it's become very apparent that this is something that we as a community need to take on and help make these resources available.
I think the idea of global classroom is applicable for countries like United States or UK or Australia. But when we teach our students the graphic design, especially in Indian context, 99% students are Indian. So then, you know, including that cultural aspect, the global culture is really challenging. So what we started doing, that we started collaborating, you know, with the students, international students, and, you know, trying to give students a collaborative project. We are also giving them a flexibility that not only the partner institutions, if you want to collaborate with a student from another country for a project, not exactly based on the credit, but yes, just to understand the different culture in graphic design, you can do that. So I think I can see that we got a very good result, but yes, where classrooms are global, for them, it's very, you know, it's easy to collaborate, because in a one class, like Rosa, you know, in one class you have students from different countries. So this is one very important point.
Adity, that notion also makes me think, you know, what is in our classroom is built by what we bring to that classroom. And when I say we, I mean all of the people who are involved, right? Like this room is full of who is here and who are maybe watching in the future, but in our classrooms, being challenged by what is there, what might not be there naturally, or what we need to bring intentionally in order to maybe cull other things up. So maybe just two thoughts on that. So one, I shared in the chat a collaboration I did with Dina Ben-Rahim, who between her students at University of Buffalo last fall and my students at KCAI, combining her typography 3 class and my graphic design histories course, tried to sort of see, okay, well, we're going to be online mostly anyway. Let's try to see what happens when we talk and share more about what we're learning. So it's an attempt, and perhaps a first attempt at having students build a text of things that they are learning to then, and in my case, and if any of my students are on this call, surprise, this is one of your textbooks for this fall, is to see what last year's students thought was interesting to them, and in hopes that maybe then they create another text, whether it be digital or physical. So wondering, okay, well, maybe we can find like a local cycle within even just the students in these cohorts to share their research. And wondering about, you know, what is in there and what is not. Now looking back on it, you know, 6-8 months later, I'm like, there's a lot of things that aren't in this book. Why? Is anybody in this classroom racist? Of course not, but at the same time, like maybe so. So it's like, okay, it's like, what do we need to press and push against and be like, well, is no one meant for this to include only the things that are in here, but that is what it is. It's 500 plus pages of this information as opposed to anything else that could have been in there. So thinking about also the publication as something that's built by people with intentions and hopes and excitement and perhaps doubt too. And that's what we're receiving. We're receiving all of that, plus ourselves coming in intersection with that. So I wonder if that maybe loop of publication is also a part of being able to see a book as, you know, not gospel, but yeah, it's just one of many, and that it's okay to take everything from it in the sense of take it all in, but know that there's more, as others have also noted.
I'm also thinking about when I'm teaching Meg's history of graphic design, but what I'm doing is kind of like engaging my students in the whole editing process of it, as what would be the ideal if this book is excluding certain things, why don't we include it? So during the semester, we're kind of like go edit it, add, take out, or combine things. So instead of, like Kalina was mentioning, instead of throwing away the canon, we open it up, we stretch it, and we find room for whatever that is excluded, and we include that. And that can be done, as I said, with the help of our students, with the other fellow educators. So we expand it, we make it more inclusive, we stretch it. Not to throw it away, because there are information there that are useful, that are relevant, but we will be active editors of this history.
Can I respond to that? I just wanted to add, like, I'm so inspired by all of these mentions of experimental publishing or small forms of publishing that are really being celebrated in this conference and in this panel. You know, you guys, the chat, we've got drawdown books, there's Lisa's project, Chinese Type Archive, even the amazing extra bold panel from a couple of days ago that's like a collaborative book project. I just wondered, I think another project is to try to convince our administrators that this is viable tenure and promotion activity. Because we need to get recognized for this kind of scholarship that's clearly so meaningful to this community, both for our teaching and for our research. And I'm also hoping that you guys are getting points towards your career advancement for those kinds of projects that are different from peer-reviewed journals or monographs or exhibitions or so on. If I can help you with that, you know, if I can help as a mid-career academic, you know, if I can help support you in any of those efforts, call on me.
Love the mentor in you.
and I mean, yeah, thinking about how publishing, I think one thing that, for example, with the Seeking Plural Narratives project, I thought, well, I mean, we essentially, don't own any of these images. Nothing is, to be made money off of. So it doesn't make any money. It's like, here's the thing, it's on Lulu. It costs exactly how much it costs, or how much it is to produce. And I think thinking, like that's a type, maybe like a level of, I don't want to say level of legitimacy, level of sort of distribution that is, that maybe by necessity is unofficial or sort of just like, or at a particular scale. So I wonder about that in relation to, the ways that we can distribute that kind of information versus maybe other ones that do need to go through different processes of publishing. So those are things that come up for me and wonder, is that something we dig into the class? Is that something that, is kind of is that part 2 at some point in some future class? Is that, for each student to choose if that's something that they're interested in pursuing, to encourage and foster that, but not necessarily build that in as a requirement. These are things that come up for me.
It'd be great if folks would publish these on the AIGA project.
Design teaching resource.
Yes. Be helpful just to see your, it laid out, because sometimes it's hard to sort of fully understand.
I have a question for the panel. Do you think that we, for the students, especially the students, attending the conference or presenting their paper in the context of learning history of graphic design help them, or this whole activity make them bored with the history, with the research? I hope my question is clear to everyone. I'm asking that if we push our students to the conference, attending the conference, presenting their idea, writing short papers, while attending the history of graphic design class, to connect with the whole different research approach of the history of graphic design, does it really help them?
One of the things that I'm working on in my research right now is I'm trying to write something that shows how historical thinking is a compatible mode of inquiry with design making, design thinking. Because it's about asking questions, it's about critical readings of culture. I'm thinking of history like historical imagination, historical thinking, and not history as an academic territory of truth finding. I'm interested in the way history is a kind of, I guess, a method of questioning that's, I think, supremely valuable to designers whose work in the future is increasingly social, increasingly oriented toward making equitable, sustainable futures, and less about serving industry. So I think this is an imperative, actually, that you bring up, Adity.
Looking forward to that, Aggie.
Well, I wanted to also, I'm going through all of our questions just to bring us back to some of the points. And I have, I'm looking at Huda's question about undocumented histories. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I take it from the perspective from the Middle East, and specifically the Arab Middle East, or the Arab world, the Arab-speaking part of the Middle East. There's a lot of course, design is like part of life. It's always been around us. People have always designed things, but there's a sort of different understanding of graphic design today. We see it more as a profession, and at the time, at previous times, people practiced it because they needed to do things, and they needed to earn money, or they had some kind of ideological motivation, or all sorts of motivations that are not, that are different from the way we look at design today. And so it was never really considered something that is worth writing about. So you see a lot of books written about the histories of art. You have art critics, you have art movements, and these artists also became, functioned and practiced as designers, but they are documented as artists, and their design work is something that is not talked about. And so when we started this project, I mean, I used to teach, so I know, and I'm not teaching at the moment for a while, but I used to teach before. And one of my problems as a teacher was, how do you teach graphic design to Arab students or students from the Middle East when there are absolutely no mention of Arab designers or designers in the Middle East in any of the books or any of the resources? We're talking about a time when the internet was not what it is today. So I couldn't send my students and say, go online or go to Instagram and, do some search, and maybe then we have something to talk about. So I think this is a problem. So the challenge, of course, is that you say, okay, I still have to teach something that makes sense, that when you design, you are not just copying what you think design is, which is something imported from another culture, because that's what's in that book that we have to teach. I also had Megs to work with. And so you have to take that challenge, and you yourself are challenged because you have no resources, and you have to actually go and do like physical field research. So something completely new. There is no one to support you. There is no one to tell you this is right, this is wrong. And so you can be naive, like I was, and I still am in some ways, and just say, I'll start with the things that speak to me, because I don't know where else to start. Nobody's going to tell me this is good design or bad design. And so it's a challenge, and it's really important that sometimes, you start to kind of go into this mode of like talking to people, and then someone refers you to someone else and say, yeah, this person was working on this project that is kind of design project, even though he's not a designer. You start to meet an artist in an art fair, and you tell them, oh, I'm interested in this, and they said, oh, I have lots of stuff, come see my work, and then you all of a sudden they open their archive and they show you what they have, and they tell you stories about other people. And it's a process that is very difficult because in a way it's not funded, and sometimes it's also, there's a part of it, somebody mentioned this idea of truth, like, is there truth in these stories? Do we know whether it's actually true or whether it's somebody's people's memories are sometimes at fault, people's egos sometimes at fault, and there is nobody to counter it. So there is something about like the responsibility, and how scared do you have to be from that responsibility? How do you choose to believe a certain perspective or certain person's voice? But you have to start somewhere, and you have to hope that somebody comes up and says, corrects your mistakes, which is again, this idea of collaboration through opening up yourself in a kind of like naively, and then hoping that you get criticism and you get corrections, which kind of improve the story as it goes along. So it's really important, and it's really important also to at some point stop and wonder, so we started by looking at people in this research project to kind of highlight pioneers of design from the Middle East, and then at some point you have only men. And this is a problem, of course. I mean, not just because I'm a woman, but because I think that can't be the truth. That can't be the only thing that is around. So how do you overcome that? How do we look for the women? So that's my next project that we have to work on seriously, because I think it's part of uncovering. It's one thing to uncover cultures that are not represented properly, but it's also important to uncover within these cultures also parts of society that are not covered and that are kind of put on the, on the back burner or in the side story or behind the scenes. So I'm sure that these kind of problems exist in many other cultures than European culture that also is written by men about men mostly. And so I think it's also, even within that, there's a lot to be looked at, and to kind of also do this research and be like really go out of your way and depend on other people and build relationships, because that's the only way to find all this information. So, you know, Briar mentioned the book of A History. I think it was very good that the title, A History of Graphic Design from the Arab World. What's it called? History of Arab Graphic Design. I think that's also their story, because I know the authors well, is very touching in the sense that they also went, you know, with this idea of we're going to write a whole history, until they realize it's impossible to write the history even of just one part of the Arab, you know, of the world. And they also went through the challenge of finding, you know, this material and finding a critical way of writing about it, and finding the people that are willing to talk about their work or to talk about the work of somebody else. So it's, yeah, it's almost like an archaeological project in some ways. You dig and then you try to make sense of the material you find. I don't want to completely capitalize the conversation here. I can talk 3 hours about this.
I wanted to also ask Raquel about she's questioning, her question is how your own design history teaching process has evolved over the years. So if you can just talk about that, and everyone else, if you can participate in sharing, like, what is the history of your teaching design history? How has it evolved?
Yes, I would love to learn how to hear, you know, to learn more about your process. And personally, for it's amazing to hear your story, Huda, about your process of doing research. I feel I can relate to that because I come from an academic background, and was kind of a struggle to be also a graphic designer and a researcher, because for so many times I had this feeling of like the imposter syndrome of a researcher, that am I allowed to say this? Is this really true? Like, people are gonna believe on what I'm saying? Because it's a process of asking yourself, asking about the resources, and being having this critical mind, but also moving forward and sharing what you learn, right? So I think it was really amazing hearing from you. And my personal process here changed in a way that I used to teach in the classroom in Brazil, and when I came to Baltimore, I transitioned to this. I think it's really cool that I'm from the list that all the panelists. I'm not teaching in the classroom nowadays, but I'm in the educator community, and that's how I feel, because of the work with the Society of Design Arts, and trying to find voices to learn from, and sharing that. Let's say that's the sharing voices that already were people would know in Brazil or in Latin America, but they are not well known in the US, and that's part of the work of translating things that already exist in other countries. We have an important book in Brazil that it was written like 20 years ago, probably. It's An Introduction of Graphic Design. And we already use this idea of, it's not the whole thing, it's a part of it. And I mean, and when I say we, of course, I'm borrowing it from a very important author in Brazil that happens to be a man. And we have that situation in Latin America as well. So that's how my process changed. I mean, trying to reach out to these researchers and people that are doing important research in Latin America, and sharing this with a new audience here. And moving to the US, I think had that impact on me, on learning about my own culture and learning more about it. So that's why, that's where it comes from for me, like how personally it changed for you, like in the past couple of years.
That's wonderful. So that takes me actually to Brockett's question about what are the characteristics of an ideal textbook. for graphic design? What would be the ideal textbook?
And you guys have already given me some ways to think about that. I was thinking about this problem in the context of global design histories and some of the things that YuJune was saying about translating or, teaching our global population with texts that have originated in North America. And I would say to try to loop that into Raquel's question, for me, like I've completely transformed the kinds of readings that I use to teach this topic in the time that I've been teaching design history. I think when I began, I used Meg's, and now I create my own kind of little reader of interesting topics. And there's some really great suggestions in the chat. Anybody care to comment on that?
I mean, this is open to everyone. It's not just our panelists. Please participate.
I wonder if we're in like a post-textbook age. I mean, there's not like one textbook that can cover everything probably, but also there's inherent value in bringing in multiple sources. I mean, that sort of puts our method of teaching right square back into what we're talking about with like diverse sources, diverse stories. And there's not one author that can have like the ultimate view. So I sometimes wonder, I think the reader is really readers are really interesting for that reason, Brockett, but I think about this a lot. Like, I just don't know if one textbook is like possible anymore.
I think the biggest deterrent with Meg's is actually not the lack of inclusion of women or the chronology, but actually the expense of it. The cost of it, the pure cost of the textbook or textbooks is an issue.
Yeah. Okay, so just speaking to that, hi everyone, sorry. So I was a student of Phil Meg's and stay friends with Libby and Elizabeth, his daughter and his wife. And I will tell you, as a student, we were all just completely broke by buying that book. And I'm so glad I did now, because it started this journey for me. But yes to that, Brockett, yes, it's so expensive. So, even as we're writing books right now, I wonder, to the panel and the rest of the people in the room, when you're writing textbooks, thinking about publishing these types of things, are you worried about the finite nature of that print and possibly the inflexibility or the non-fluid nature of it expanding and all of the economics that go into expanding down the line?
Absolutely. That's why I think it's important. I think that any kind of survey is just not a great idea, but more sort of histories and as Aggie was saying, having some kind of reader. But something I said in the comments is just that also readers are really expensive because you have to get permissions, and it is a lot of I actually have never made a reader because it has been expensive and really time consuming. Has anyone made a reader before? Have you made one, Aggie?
No, but I'm thinking of Teal Trigg's reader, which is like the thickest thing ever. Yeah. But I'm interested in maybe how a reader might function to prompt thought as opposed to be this kind of like Bible of stuff that's been written.
Yes. I like the idea of making my own reader, like the classic. I mean, I still have some of my readers from school, not design readers. They didn't make design readers. I had Russian readers, but which made, they could pick the stories they wanted us to read and stuff, but they are kind of expensive to make. I've looked into it. So that's just something that I'm putting out there.
So
doesn't mean it's impossible, but we have to get permissions.
Briar, also, I would like to mention your question that how do we continue to evolve in a curriculum with such a limited time? You were mentioning that the time that we are given to teach is not enough. So what is your thoughts on that?
I mean, I just feel I don't have an answer. That's why I put the question there. Because this is my utter sort of, the constant question I have for this class, which is something I've been thinking about this summer, and how do I evolve my curriculum to expand beyond the US and European borders. And I don't have an answer because, well, there's also my knowledge limitations, which I'm constantly self-educating. And I know, there's an idea of like bringing in the students, but also there's just a time limitation. So I'm always thinking, there's, instead of lectures, maybe there's different methodologies. Lisa has had some success with that model. So maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, one thing that's making me think of too is kind of like the layers of supplement to a class, right? So for example, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years ago, but I remember we were talking about protest posters in class, and someone asked about the Vietnam War and essentially was like, I don't really know what we're talking about. And it was like, but also I was like, well, I mean, it sort of took everybody, I think, or it took me certainly a moment to say, oh, like we need to talk more about that. Like otherwise these posters are just protest posters as we might understand them here. So like, they're sort of like are there like films to watch that aren't about design, but are things that are interesting to watch, like documentaries, movies about these stories from that time, from other times, and then is there sort of the recommended readings, which are things that you could read if you wanted to dig in further, and then like actual, the things that you really need to read, which are available and not in a textbook and free. So I think when I think about like how to better support what is happening in whatever it is that we're reading, I wonder how better can I support that context without being a historian myself, without being a specialist in American history or world histories or anybody. I am what I am learning, but I am finding myself needing and wanting to learn more of that so that I can present that information with more color, because that's clearly what it needs.
I think that is a good segue to YuJune's question about how can we teach a history of ideas rather than history of individuals. So YuJune, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've been talking a lot about at Parsons, that in the design world, we kind of lean into hagiography. It's kind of like, here's this famous person and here's this other famous person. And then recently the trend has been, here's this unsung hero that needs to be, his work needs to now be recognized. But the problem with that approach is that it discounts all the contextual information around like kind of society, culture, technology. And it also discounts the fact that the history of graphic design is also the history of communication, and that we are all participants in that. And so we can't have a list of people kind of take place of this larger conversation. It doesn't do it justice. And so this is just a larger question that I have. And I think part of it's because it's so much easier to write a history of people than it is to write a history of ideas. And I think this is something that other fields are also wrangling with. Like you see this conversation happening in architecture, for example, that has a longer kind of history than our field. So I just put it out there, how you kind of approach this and how we can have a truly kind of a more inclusive history of design, in which that I'm being very inarticulate today, but that includes us all as being part of this conversation.
And I'm looking at Aditi's question about the mindset of students that when they look at the title of our class, it's history, and what happens, Aditi?
It's a very interesting question, you know, for me also actually. So I can see my transformation. I started as a graphic designer. Then I moved to teach the students directly the graphic designing, especially in a vocational training center. Then to the university level. So you can see when I was in a vocational training center, I saw we were more towards the software, color theory, principle of design, elements of design, that's it. But when we move to the undergrads level or post-graduation level, when I actually started teaching the history of graphic design. And I suddenly realized that the word graphic design, students are more mentally ready that they're going to learn something practical. They're going to learn something designing, probably the skill. But when we start talking about the history, they see, you know, it's very tough to convince them. So I think my transformation, you know, I still don't know the answer, but my transformation is that I understood that, you know, you can say teacher-centric classroom to student-centric classroom. I did actually. I started teaching them history and I understood that they are not paying attention at all. So they are more interested to ask me when we are going to start the practical session, right? But yes, when I involve them, when I tell them that, yes, this is the content, you yourself, the owner of this content, you have to understand where you are located within this culture, within this content, then probably, you know, they have started taking interest. But yes, I still observe that many students, those who are not interested in the history part, they are more interested in the skill part. Probably someone else can give, you know, some of the technique or tools to involve them in the history class.
I think it was in one of the panels that Arceneaux mentioned that when she started adding the history to the graphic design class, the students were complaining to the director about this class not being a design class, becoming a sociology class. And this is something that we were thinking, like, how can you incorporate history into our studio classes and showing our students that everything is interrelated within the disciplines. We can work together, even like do cross-cultural, cross-discipline work. So what are your thoughts about that? I want the attendees to also participate. I haven't heard from any of you. Please do participate.
At CalArts, I remember Lorraine Wild had this 1-year course. It wasn't a semester long, and she had this massive reader, and she covered art history, technology history, design history, kind of war history, you know, everything weaved together, and it was amazing. Although I had taken multiple histories throughout my lifetime, but I pretty much sat in that class. I think every year I was there, the whole 3 years. And it would grow and it would change. So if we could agree somehow within our schools to kind of bring a kind of a comprehensive kind of overriding look to history and kind of weave them together, art history and design history, and maybe even some just regular history together, that would be fascinating. And I know that's a challenging kind of task to even approach.
Elio, you're muted.
Sorry. What I was saying is that history tends to be perceived as something boring. So students register if it is required, or if it is a substitute for another course. And there are two issues here, I would say. One is to identify the content that is going to be inclusive, it's going to respect more than what we have learned. Like I learned European design and I have to kern type perfectly the way that it's supposed to be done, and I follow those practices. And I try to include other voices. If you include voices that are not well recognized, it's tricky to deliver that content, because you have to demonstrate why you think that is important, that the student also believes. Okay, that's one issue. The other issue is how you present that information. I took 2 history of cinema classes when I was in college, and I absolutely loved them. I never thought that history was going to be so interesting, but it was the way that the instructor delivered it. I thought that she was telling me tales. That's why, and I got completely lost in what she was saying. So it's not only the content, but how the content is delivered. And that's the part that we need to also, we need instructors who are, I always say, we need to be actors in the classroom. We need to perform as if we were on the stage to keep that audience engaged. So then maybe we can break a little bit this stigma of history being boring and not, that whatever happens right now happens because something happened before, and these are the results of those events. And I don't know, that would be my 2 cents about this issue. It's complex. Just trying to include these other voices and demonstrate that they are important, and it is not your hidden agenda. What I commented yesterday when a student told me in the classroom in an evaluation, Elliot talks too much about Latinos. So I said, okay, this is not going to be, be seen as something positive. So I said, I am going to cut it down as much as I can. So I am not, pigeonholed or put it in that frame.
I have a question for a couple of my fellow panelists, if that's okay, because it was an important point that was brought up about that Aggie and Lisa brought up about historical imagination, and I would actually love to learn more. What you mean by that, how you roll that into the classroom.
I'm secretly hoping Lisa will talk about her class. I think it's so, I don't actually teach design history at WashU, but I try to incorporate, this is more about my research at design history, and I try to incorporate history in my classroom. I think Lisa teaches a truly inspiring design history course. I'm sorry, Lisa, I'm putting you on the spot, but I would really love for you to to talk about your class.
Aggie, you're my inspiration. You are, just to say that, I think, no, well, just to be super clear, I love hearing you talk. I think when Aggie mentioned historical imagination earlier, I think it excited me in the sense that, right, because that I think I come to teaching with a sort of maybe like a hope for imagining together. So to me, it makes sense to be in the sort of look at history, look at the ways that history is brought to our attention and imagine from there, because I think that's what we do, or I believe that that's what happens. So just giving that a name and maybe just saying that might be, and I saw in the chat, maybe traditional historians might be a little cringed by that, but I one, completely respect all you historian PhDs out there, but I think as a maybe emerging or sort of very sort of youthful sprout in historian interests, I think I relish in the fact that there's space for me to go from there, and not only have to know it all or only have to know what is not everything out there, but to take whatever it is that I know so far and know that that's a valid place. And I want my students to also believe that even if they don't know everything about all of the things that happened before they were born, that's okay. That's interesting. It's interesting to be looking at all of this stuff from there. It's also interesting to add to that. It's also interesting for me to be challenged by that and be scared every time I teach this class, because it feels like an absolute, and maybe Briar, to your question, to your thought earlier, you have 10 weeks and you feel like you have the whole world to share, and it will not happen. So my hope is that we can at least sort of see how much there is together.
I just think, I didn't mean to put you on a spot. I just find it to be a super compelling idea. And I could see a relationship between what Elio was saying, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about kind of student engagement and helping to activate history within the classroom and help them understand how the past kind of frames the present. So it seems like there's an interesting opportunity there.
June, I just wrote in the chat, the most memorable class I ever took was a cultural anthropology theory class. And the professor would start every session talking about his family and things that were going on. This is probably not the most politically correct, but he would show up with a picture and be like, this is my daughter's new partner, new boyfriend. Can we talk about this? And that guy was all tattooed and whatever. But he made an effort the whole semester to make theory relevant to day-to-day experiences. And then he would give us the heavy readings, but we would have an example that we could say, oh my God, Margaret Mead was talking about this, but then we can see this in today. And I never forgot that experience because he really made a dry and annoying topic in a way that showed me what pedagogy was capable of. And so, you know, I think that with history, I try to do the same thing. It's not about teaching history as it's thousands of years old. It's the lesson there shown today, and how are we going to take it after now to the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that I really, really, really struggle with. And this is just an honest confession. And I don't have any solutions. Is what histories do we teach? What is the, and then when I extrapolate backwards from there, I'm like, what is the methodology by which we even collect design history, right? That is to me the thing that I don't have the answer for yet. And I'm like, you can't have one methodology. You can have certain frameworks, right, that kind of guide what we collect, how we collect it, how we preserve it. But I you know, I lie in bed and think about this at night. You know, it's like, as we are expanding the resources available to students, what methodologies are we using? And there is actually a robust history outside of our field. You know, there are several people with PhDs about this who can talk about, you know, the methodologies for collecting ideas. And I'm very humbled by this endeavor that we're all embarking on, because I feel like design is such a nascent field, you know, in the history of fields. I think that it's something that we're all trying to solve together.
YuJune, on that path, I think there are so many questions, and yet you have so many answers as well on how we can approach all those methodologies, content, kind of practices. So I'm actually, just want to make a quick announcement, embarking on this kind of hopeful research with some of my colleagues, including Lisa Maione and Ramon Tejada and Caesar and a few others, to try to see if we can kind of have a comprehensive survey on what is being done in graphic design history classes in junior colleges, in universities and PhDs across the US at least. And then kind of see what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. Maybe we can kind of learn from each other and kind of have it somewhat of a kind of a platform to kind of build upon in a united manner, if that's even useful or not. So I'm going to put that in the chat, that link, that if you guys want to sign up to receive that survey. And we're just starting to work on it, so it'll probably be a few months before it's even ready. But I'm hoping that next time we talk, we'll have a little more solid answers on some of these.
Yeah, it's just any act of collecting, right, reveals values. You're making an explicit statement about what matters and what's worth collecting. And so this is I think a conversation that has to happen actually within the broader design educators community, and it's something that we should be doing together.
This is why I think the People's History Project is so interesting, because it's crowdsourced. And I mean, archives aren't neutral spaces. They're already infused with value systems. They're determined by an institution, what's collectible, or they're inherited from a private collector who already sort of aligns their collection with their personal values. So when we go to an archive, we're not engaging some neutral space where history takes place. It's already infused and with value systems. Yeah.
I've started following a lot of archivists on Twitter, and it's been very enlightening. And I encourage you to do the same if that's interesting. And maybe you do, YuJune. Dorothy Berry is my favorite.
I hate to do this, but it is 12:30 and we actually have another session on the East Coast. We have another session happening in half an hour. So we actually need to kind of wrap up so that can start on time. But Roshanak, do you have any final thoughts to sort of leave us with?
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask everyone if you can sum it up, what you're taking away from this panel in the chat box. Lisa, I don't know if you can save the chats.
We will share it out. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So there's a lot of information there that everyone shared, wonderful resources. And I want to thank you all for being here and contributing and being involved and active. Thank you.
That was
Thank you all so
incredible.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us. So please do come back in about half an hour. And we are going to have another panel based on teaching. It's going to be fantastic. So please come back, go take a break, and then come back, and we'll see you in just a few.